Welcome back, everybody.
Hello.
This is the Ask Us Anything podcast, and we are here with just Pastor Nathaniel Lee.
And we're here with yourself.
Not to say that you're, just you,
It's okay.
but we're missing Derek. And
You got the Walmart version of Derek.
yeah, exactly.
Me.
So
I do feel like I rail on Walmart. It's not that bad. It's actually awesome.
it's also, is it as cheap as it used to be? I don't know.
Probably not here, but dude, get diapers at Walmart.
Diapers are tricky. You need good quality.
Dude, Walmart quality and price point. It's good.
That's the one.
Should we start over?
No, this is what this
All
is.
right, cool.
I don't expect this to go uphill. So
Okay, sweet.
good luck, everybody. We are here. We're going to dig more into Acts 17. Once again, this is the Ask Us Anything podcast here at Center Grace Church in Beverly, Massachusetts. If you like this, if you enjoy learning about Walmart diapers, you can subscribe and you can like the videos on YouTube too, because that helps promote it and they'll send it out to more people if you like doing that.
Maybe Walmart could sponsor us.
Yeah. I'm sure we're almost there with our massive audience. Oh yeah. All right, we're gonna. If you haven't listened to it already, check out the recent sermon by Derek this past week on Acts 17. We didn't get any questions for this week based on that sermon, and we said let's still chat because Nathaniel has preached on Acts 17 before, and you said you got a lot more. You've had some thoughts on this in the past, and we're gonna just dive in, talk about it more, and we're gonna go wherever we go, and let's do it.
Cool.
So you said, do you want to start with the outline we were talking about, or?
Yeah, I think so. Derek, great sermon, and I think Acts 17 is so rich. It was one of those texts that I think we could get into more of the weeds that Derek didn't have time to get into.
Should we give
in the sermon?
Is there like a way to give a brief summary, of Acts? I'm saying if someone hasn't, if they're like, what's in Acts 17?
Acts 17 is Paul going to Athens to preach the gospel there, and what's maybe unique about Acts 17 for our context, and why I think it deserves a double take or a deeper dive is, if you think about it, out of all the contexts Paul goes to in the book of Acts, Athens might be the most similar to our present moment. Obviously, when you're talking about other side of the world in 2,000 years, you're never going to have something that's that close. But Athens is a pluralistic context like our own. It's a very academic, intellectual context like the Boston area. And it's very much a place that's like had some former glory, like Boston. You could argue Boston was the center of American life in the 1700s and maybe even into the 1800s. But just as Athens lost it to Rome, Boston lost it to New York. You could, I mean, again, oversimplification for sure, but there's a lot of similar dynamics in terms of cultural affinities. And you could even argue like Athens went through it was kind of at its religious peak in the center of the Greco-Roman Empire, 200 or 300 years before Paul got there, as Derek even alluded to. And that you could almost argue the same for Boston. Like Boston was very much a religious hub in the 1700s. And it's very much, not anymore. So anyway, that's all to say, I think we can learn a lot from how Paul witnesses and proclaims the gospel and navigates that context in a way that, I'm not saying we can't learn anything from Acts 13, Acts 14, but the cultural bridge is a little shorter in Athens. So that's just a brief, setup.
Cool.
But I thought maybe we could go through the text and point out things Paul did.
Yeah.
And maybe kind of tease out what it might look like for us to do. Sound like a game plan?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, some of this is recapping what Derek did, but it's maybe putting it in a different lens. But the acronym, if you want to kind of capture this, is I.M.P.A.C.T. And I'll just give all 6 things you see from Paul doing in Athens that I think we can learn from. And it's not like, here's a 6-step program on how to reach your neighbors. That's not really what I'm going for here. It's more so, here are 6 things Paul does that I think can shape our mode for witness. in our late modern Western context. Just things that we need to make sure that we are incorporating in some aspect of our lives. So impact. First, I'll just mention all 6, then we can go through.
Sure.
1 is
I.
Identifying idols. M is being moved with compassion. Derek talks a good bit about that. P is being present in strategic context and places. So presence. A is affirming the agreement or the common grace elements that we have with our non-Christian neighbors. What are the areas of overlap between the gospel and, the other beliefs and systems and narratives? C is challenge those narratives based on their own inconsistencies. And then T, tell them of the good news of the resurrection in Christ. Tell them that their deepest longings can only find their fulfillment in Christ. So I.M.P.A.C.T is the acronym. And then we can go through each of them, but I'm always like, let's give them.
I'm taking notes.
Sweet.
You guys love acronyms. I guess it's helpful.
I usually don't do acronyms. I like alliterations, but I found this acronym helpful.
Okay.
More memorable, if you will.
Is there
cheesy, but.
So with this acronym? I mean, where'd you hear this? Is this seminary where they came up with this? Is this or you don't even remember?
This was kind of an outline that came to me when I preached once on Acts 17, and I was like, I see 6 points in this text, and I can't preach a 6-point sermon without some kind of acronym or easy to remember thing. So this is my only 6-point sermon.
So this is a Nathaniel Lee original acronym.
I'm sure the Holy Spirit gave me some kind of dream or something or thought in the shower or something.
All right. Is there an order of operations to these things? Is there an order of operation to this or no?
Well, yeah, let's go. Maybe we could go through it logically. So I'll highlight in the text where you see this, and then maybe we could just talk about the practicality.
Okay.
So ask any questions. So I'll keep it brief on the exegesis because Derek did a great job going through it. So identify our culture's idols. You see this in verse 16 and verse 22 of Acts 17. Paul was waiting, as he was waiting for Silas and Timothy to Athens, he saw the city was full of idols. And the word see is, I think, too weak because it's the Greek word theoreo. And you can even hear our English word theorize. There are 2 or 3 words for see or look at in the Greek. The usual word is the word blepo, I see. And it's kind of more like, oh, I see you. But theoreo is a deeper level of see. You can almost translate it, he perceived in his, like, he understood at a deeper level. Like one is like just, oh, I see the object there. And the other is like, oh, I see that laptop is there because it is programming. It's like it indicates a level of comprehension. And I think it's so simple, but it's easy to miss that Paul did not just come in hot with an agenda, with a preconceived idea of what salvation would look like for the Athenians. He needed to first understand what were they worshiping. And Derek spent a good amount of time, so I don't want to rehash anything Derek said, but talking about everybody worships. But I almost just want to point out on a broader level, he saw that they worshiped and what they worshiped. And again, Derek kind of talked about, if you're kind of pushing back and you're like, I don't think everybody worships, I would just reference Derek's sermon. He spent a good amount of time and argued convincingly that everybody does in fact worship, and everybody, is religious in some way.
There's a David Foster Wallace quote that has been brought up half dozen times now in podcasts and sermons because it's so effective in communicating that.
Yeah. So what again, and this is where feel free to ask any questions. What I'd love to just kind of nail down is then what does it look like for us to identify idols? Paul did it. And then in verse 22, he goes on to say, I perceive that your city is full of idols. Like, again, that's a deeper level. He's like, I get it. I understand.
When you say, well, I guess on the identifying idols, are you saying that in terms of like a broader cultural context of, oh, here's the idols of our culture, or individually, you're talking with this person, you're building relationship with this person, and you realize there's an idol?
I mean it in three ways,
Okay.
two of which you said. One, on a personal level, do we identify our own idols? Are we identifying, do we really understand the stories in our own lives that are not completely aligned with the gospel? Do we understand the besetting sins and the repetitive patterns of our hearts that are drawn away from Christ? Do we understand? So that's one. Two, do we understand the specific ways that our loved ones, whether they're Christians or not Christians, have idols? Like, what are, like, do we know? And again, I'm not saying everybody can come along and be like, I know your idol. I know your idol.
Sure.
I know your idol. But do we kind of know people well enough to see what their hearts are drawn to? Do we theoreo their idols? Do we perceive what they're worshiping? And then on the broader sense, which is what you were mentioning 2 and 3, the broader sense, do we understand our culture's idols? Because not every culture has the same idols. I think it was one pastor said, you know, in Boston, they ask you, how much do you know? In New York, they ask you, how much money do you make? In Washington, D.C., they ask you how much power you have. In LA, they ask you, like, how much influence are you having, or like, what have you done entertainment wise? And those are super general. And of course, that doesn't, it's somewhat stereotypical, but like, do we understand our very macro context idols, like the narratives that are in the water? Do we just understand them?
Because that's like the water you swim around and you don't notice.
Exactly. And that's what makes Paul so interesting. And what he's doing is interesting. It says he theoreos it. He really understands it. And I think the problem with most of us in our late modern Western culture is we just walk side by side with our idols, and we never, personal and cultural and our neighbors' idols, and we never really see them because they're like you're saying, they're like the water we swim in.
I'll say on the personal side, I think that's where community is so effective or required. But there's kind of this extra, I don't want to say extra layer, but I think sometimes people become Christians and they don't want to come to grips with, like, hey, Nathaniel, I want you to be a mirror for me.
Sure.
Right? Like, if I'm at my best, I should be saying to myself, I want those around me to be a mirror for me who can help to point out my idols to me that I'm blind to.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if I'm seeking, if that's what I'm pursuing, is to cast down any idols in my life, then you need those around you to say, hey man, you seem a little preoccupied with those materialistic things, or you seem a little preoccupied with these types of things, or too concerned or worried over this area of your life,
Totally. I think that's so true on a personal level, and also true as well on a cultural level. And I think
that's very unpopular. And
absolutely.
This, especially New England area, it's like, it's like, mind your own business, man.
Yeah.
Don't tell me, like, know what it is? When someone shines a light on you, there's a deep impulse in a lot of us, and maybe everyone, to immediately shine that light back on them and say, who are you to talk? Right. And it takes growing this muscle of being like, this person is saying this for my own good and out of love for me.
Yeah.
But yet, without taking it defensively.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to know your own idols. Is you're not seeing this again, the acronym, the 6 steps, makes it sounds like this is some kind of 6-step evangelism, but it's not that actually.
Yeah.
It's more like, here are 6 facets that we need to operate in the world. And it has to be done out of humility, like you were saying, because we have to know that we have our own idols. We are idol factories, as Calvin would say. And that's why when you're discerning other people's idols, you're theoreoing idols. You're not putting yourself above other people. You're trying to understand yourself and other people, because you cannot love people unless you know them.
Yeah.
To say you love somebody without knowing them is really more about yourself than the other person. And so really what this first thing is with the I is like, you just are knowing people on a deeper level, and you're knowing that every human being is fundamentally not a thinking thing, but a loving thing. We are worshiping creatures first and foremost. And so in order to love anybody, Christian or not Christian, meaning the person loving, you actually have to get to know them. And the way to know someone best is, what do they love? What are their hopes? What are their fears? What are the narratives, the stories that they are telling themselves both for the world and for their own lives. What are they afraid of? What do they want in life? What do they, what gets them out of bed? And do we just know these idols in our neighbors' lives and in our cultural? And this, again, I think this almost takes us to a place where we have to think like anthropologists at all times. And I'm not calling everybody to go like read 100 books about, like read Charles Taylor and understand, but you've got to at least have a baseline understanding of being able to, like, when you watch a movie, seeing what are the narratives that are telling me. And I'm not saying like, what are the demonic messages there? That's not the point, but just even being able to understand what is the deeper message there. Yeah. What is the protagonist being portrayed as? Like, what is the good value? And I think what we often just need to see is because again, what we're going to talk about 2 points from now is it's not all bad. It's always, always, always a mixed bag. There's always really, really good things in every single story. Every Disney story has something that's utterly beautiful in it and something that's bent in it as well. Every story has something that reflects the gospel and then something that's a distortion of the gospel. So we just need to identify idols. And I think, again, this is not a how-to guide per se, but it's more so just like a little bit of practical advice. And I do think getting to know our neighbors and really listening to what do they want in life? What are they afraid of in life? What are they worshiping? That's going to take time. And I do think it's going to take some reading. Like, read through types of literature that you would not be accustomed to. Like, if you're a more conservative person, read the New York Times, read the Atlantic, read the Boston Globe, and read the op-ed pieces, is what I'm talking about, not like just the news headlines, and understand, like, become a sociologist in some sense. Like, do what Paul did. Go through the city and look at the idols. When you're in Boston or when you're in downtown Beverly, don't just think antagonistically, I disagree with that, I disagree with that. Understand first. We got to know people before we can love them.
Let me tell you something based on that. And you tell me fully, honestly, if you think it's a bad idea, good idea. But or if you think I'm wrong, because
Let's go for it.
My wife sometimes has said, Matt, you shouldn't listen to this or that podcast, because I'll listen to podcasts that are like very mainstream podcasts. I'll listen to a Joe Rogan podcast. You know what I mean? And my wife will she'll overhear something. She's like, he's swearing, he's this or that. He's talking about drug use. He's talking about all these things. And I've always told her, I've said, like, what I find most interesting about it is these podcasts and whatnot are so popular. I feel like this is like, I get a picture of what the world thinks. Yeah. Right. And it's kind of what you're saying is, I'm like, this is how I feel like I understand how people, because we're somewhat in a bubble, because a lot of what we do is within the church. A lot of our friends are Christians, a lot of our friends. So I tell her, it's, to a degree, you need to guard yourself against it, because like, you're consuming things, and that consumption is always somewhat mutual, and those things will try to consume you back. But I've always felt that that's always been one of the ways that I've tried to be an anthropologist. What do you think about that? Is that a bad idea? Good idea? What do you think there?
I think it's mostly a good idea. I'd say it's really good to diversify the portfolio of people you're listening to, even if you don't. I think it's really healthy to listen to people you don't agree with. The only area I would say maybe dial it back, and not with you personally, but is if someone is radically affected by it to a degree. So to whatever degree you go out and listen to other narratives, you also need to be constantly baptizing your own imagination and your heart in the narratives of Scripture.
Sure.
So it's like, I'm not necessarily recommending like, go watch every single movie on Netflix and like, learn.
Nathaniel told me I need to be a student of the culture.
Right. It's like, you need to know your limits. So some people are affected more by others. So for example, like, I'll just give an example. Like, I loved the TV show The Bear, but I think there were probably like 400 F words in like 8, like, but I'm personally, I feel like, I hope I don't get in trouble for this. Like, I'm not as affected by
Sure.
language, but like I personally, and I would probably recommend people not watch things with sex in it, because I don't see how you can watch that and not be affected, or at least skip it and look ahead on IMDb Parents Guide, like, and know where it's coming so you can skip it. Again, I think there's a liberty of conscience there, but I watched that show because I thought it was really, really good story, but there's all kinds of very interesting analysis. Like, and without spoiling the show, one of the I think two narratives that stuck out to me there is like, how do people deal with depression and loss? And there's just a really, really interesting narrative there. But then I think this is probably going to make it in some sermon illustration. I just have another opportunity, but there's a moment in the show, I'll keep it vague to not spoil, where one of the characters lets one of the other characters know, I truly love you and I care about you. And I think that's an example of a narrative. It's the end of the first season where you're like, the deepest longing of the human heart is to be two things: to be seen and known, and to hear a word of I love you. And that's, I don't care who you are, that's what we want deepest. And that's what I learned from that show. Again, I enjoyed the show, but like there's kind of, again, you got to have this identifying the idols, and the idols aren't like 100% wrong. That no idol is 100% wrong. What makes idols dangerous and captivating is they have a lot of right in them. And what I mean by right is, so every idol is going to be a way that you are trying to be known and loved. The desire to be known and loved is itself good. The way you are looking for it is wrong if it's other than God. We want to rest, but our hearts are restless until they rest in God. So anyway, I'm going off in a digression, but sure. I'd say I'll be balanced here. I need to learn to be more balanced with my critiques of technology, but social media has a huge pro and a potential danger, and it's up to the person. Yeah. Whether every algorithm is trained to get you to silo you. Yeah. Right. So you need to intentionally push back on those algorithms and diversify your portfolio, whether it's on YouTube or podcast or social media. So social media can be a huge benefit to introducing you. I'd say this is, in my opinion, the biggest pro to social media, or top 2 or 3, is introducing you to content that's really helpful that you would not have found on your own. You could say this about Spotify, to like, here's a suggested artist, to a YouTube video, here's a suggested YouTube video. But it takes discipline on behalf of the consumer to not just follow the rabbit trail of suggestions. You have to look out. You have to intentionally seek out things that you would disagree with, because we all know what Facebook algorithm is going to do to us. It's going to isolate us if we're not careful. But if you kind of start looking for things you disagree with, that's when Facebook, that's when YouTube, that's when Instagram can really help you. Is if you start pushing back a little bit to I'm only ever going to isolate myself in my liberal or my conservative media, not think tank, but echo chamber. And I'm really gonna read things I disagree with to learn, not just to lob grenades at, because we have to be students of culture, I guess, is the big point on this eye.
So, and on that, like, the big point behind that is you have to know yourself, right? Like, there's things that I would listen to that there's other people too that, like, obviously my kids, I will never have them. Absolutely. I will never put those podcasts on in the car with my kids in there.
Yeah. And you're listening and I'm watching the bear, not just to like, we're not ignoring the parts that are wrong. What we're doing is what Paul's doing. We're going through the city and we're looking at the idols. Yeah. But Paul's not going through like saying like, wow, Zeus is great. I love Zeus's sexual ethic. Like, he's saying, I'm going to understand what all these stories about Zeus are saying. Like, I need to understand, which we'll get to when we talk about the A, but like, he understands their poets and their philosophers. That doesn't mean he agrees with them. Yeah. But we can't only be reading Christians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or hanging out with Christians for that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole nother thing.
Which again, this is kind of getting to the P. So I'll stop there. But anyway.
Okay. Let's move. Do you want to move on to the M, or what letter do you want to go to?
Yeah, we'll go M.
I don't know if these
they flow in terms of like, they are actually in chronological order.
Sure.
So in the text, that is. So M
moved
is
with compassion.
And Derek spent a whole lot of time talking about this, so I won't do a whole lot, but I'll just mention in verse 16 and verse 18.
Before we go past it.
Yes.
Sorry. One last thing on the I. Derek in the sermon, he said something that like in our small group, everyone had like kind of starred this point. He had said, look at where you're most exhausted, and
Yes.
that's the thing that you're chasing.
Yes. And you can do that with yourself, with your neighbors, and with the culture. So again, maybe to just,
It was just such a good point. I wanted to put it out there because when I heard that, I sat there thinking about that for 10 minutes, you know?
yeah, absolutely. I think an idol of our culture is justice. And we could maybe even tease that out, meaning you clearly see in these protests that people want wrongs to be made right.
Yeah.
And we'll tease that out. So anyway,
Okay. Now move on.
M is moved by love and compassion. The text says that the text says his spirit was provoked within him. He was moved by the idolatry in Athens. So again, Derek did a really good job of pointing out this is the way God's heart is described towards his people. And I think it's really important because when we talk about our mode in the world, it's really easy when you hear me say something and you hear Derek say something like, we need to act like anthropologists. It's very easy to think this is all a heady, disembodied, intellectual only exercise. And it's not. Paul is moved to compassion. And I think our motives have to be love. And I think so many times we as Christians operate in the world with a hunker down mentality. We think, I'll just give you some examples. I love my family. I love my community. But some of the feedback we heard by moving here and staying here was like, are you not, again, and maybe this is an unfair summary of things I've heard, but like, are you not concerned about how your kids are going to turn out? I think that's a valid concern. I don't want to dismiss that at all. Like, we need to have a protection impulse as well. We don't need to get rid of that. Paul consistently says, guard your heart. He consistently says, be aware of, Satan, and Peter will say, Satan is a roaring lion in your midst. Watch out. At the same time, Paul and Peter and Jesus their hearts are breaking for their unbelieving neighbors. And it was something one of my mentors, Jeremy McKean, said, I can't remember who he was quoting, but he says, I don't want to build a steeple in a safe place. I want to plant a church a mile from hell. Jesus said, I did not come to call the righteous, but the lost. And so are we moved? Are our hearts breaking? And if our hearts are not breaking for unbelievers, that is a very telltale sign that there is a virus in us, a spiritual virus. And it usually will take one of two forms. It will take the form of you are more concerned about self-preservation and anger toward your neighbors, and you no longer care about their salvation. That's one form of the virus.
Yeah.
If you no longer have any kind of compassion and move toward your neighbors, you're trending towards a fundamentalist, antagonistic approach, which is, I don't care about my neighbors. I'm scared of my neighbors. I'm scared of the lies of the culture, and I'm only scared. There's a certain level of healthy concern, but I fear, and that means you fear the culture more than God. Paul he knows this is the Lord's world. He knows that there's nothing the Athenians could do. There's nothing the Romans could do to undo God's sovereignty. He knows that everybody who God calls to himself will come to God. He's not afraid. He's cautious. He's careful. He's not afraid. The other virus that could take the form is you've completely assimilated to the culture. You've completely said, why would I have compassion why would I be moved to compassion on my neighbors? There's nothing wrong with them. They have their truth. I have my truth. You would say that Paul's feeling of pity is like intellectual superiority, or but Paul's not seeing that he is better. He's seeing lost people that need Jesus. He's seeing himself as a fellow beggar, pointing other beggars to where the bread is at. So again, to kind of recap, if you don't have any kind of moved in your spirit, it's usually because you're too afraid. Let's batten down the hatches and get by. Let's all cloister ourselves. Let's protect ourselves. Or you've completely assimilated and you're completely the exact same as your unbelieving neighbors in terms of there's nothing different about your life. There's nothing different about what you worship. So you don't have any pity because you're in the same boat as them completely. So this is where you hear the phrase that we talk about. It's in our mission statement. We got to be faithfully present. And if you have zero compassion for your neighbors, what Derek was talking about, if your heart's not churning, there's a virus in you, and it's going to take one or two forms. It's an isolating virus, or it's an assimilating virus. And so there's not really any practical how to. It's just know which one of those viruses you have. And if you have here's some practical stuff. If you have the isolating virus, you need to see that you are far more sinful than you think you are, that Jesus had to come and get you. We're in the West. The gospel, came about in first century Israel. Someone didn't isolate themselves. You could say millions of people didn't isolate themselves. We are a result of someone going out of their comfort zone. Ultimately, we're a result of Jesus, not looking at how gross we were and being like, ooh, I don't want to go to earth. But the Son of God said, they're so far gone, I want to save them. But on the other hand, if you're struggling with complete assimilation, you need to see that the Son of God had to come save us. He was so holy, he was so merciful, he chose to come, but he's so holy, he had to die. And so you need to see that both people need to see that they have sin in different ways. But anyway, that's how I think it's the beginnings of how we can be moved with compassion. You need to see, in the words of the parable that Jesus tells, you need to see how much debt you were forgiven of. The first person doesn't think they have a debt, that they didn't rack up any debt. And the second person also doesn't think they have a debt. And that's why they're not moved to compassion. But when you really see how much you've been forgiven of in Christ, you're going to be moved to compassion for those who don't know the grace. So the long story short, the practical how-to of the M is look at the gospel. Don't try harder. Don't beat yourself up. Look at the gospel. Look at how loving and holy God is and how desperately in need you were of his salvation. You still are every day. I don't know. Any thoughts or questions? That one's maybe the most kind of straight to the point.
No, I'm just trying to be, I'm just thinking of myself. And if there's anything, I think I'm trying to be self-critical here. And I'm like, at times I can be apathetic towards my neighbor unknowingly and thinking, like you're saying, okay, just focused on myself and my family without the thought of like, okay, this may move into P as well, but a big topic. I have kids, and the big question is public school or private Christian school. Sure. Right. And this is the debate my wife and I, it's not even a debate. We're kind of in agreement on this, but we've gone back and forth about what you're talking about, what is the right thing, because how we want to be present within our community outside of the church. We want to be present outside of the church. But then the question is like, well, are we going to end up sacrificing our children on the altar of that by not protecting them enough? That's the impulse. I know it's not the reality, but like, it feels like, well, are they sacrificing on behalf of that mission for us? To be present with, because right now Sienna is in a private school and Zachary's in public school, and that's just because she can't be in public school yet. She's too young. Sure. But right now we're planning on sticking with public school, but we're kind of like going it kind of year by year, seeing how it's going, planning to be with public school. But just the other day, Zachary had he had a birthday party at Sky Zone, and we're there with all the other parents, and it's a very different vibe to be at a big birthday party with everyone, and you might be the only Christian in the room. And I'm kidding, I'm like nudging her. I'm like, this is the benefit of public school, is we get these situations. And I think there's also this, I don't know if I'd call it a selfish desire. There's a selfish desire to just say, like, keep my kids in, like, I want to protect them. I want to make sure the gospel is strong within their mind before the other ideas begin bombarding into their minds as well. I don't know. That's a really good, I don't have a great answer. This is what's all coming to mind.
Well, let's tease it out, and let's jump to the P, and let me just briefly mention, and then because I think it's a really good case study of how do you navigate that. The P is present with people in their places. Try saying that 5 times. I'll just want to mention the text, and then let's go back to what you were saying. Sure. We're told Paul is in the synagogues and in the marketplace. He uses Luke uses the phrase in verse 17 in the imperfect tense, which is a Greek tense to say ongoing, which suggests Paul was, he also says the phrase every day. Paul's teaching in the agora is a habit. He's not identifying the narratives and idols from afar. He's consistently getting down into the weeds with real people in their places. Again, I don't want to turn this into a Bible study, but I just want to briefly point what Paul is doing. He's consistent in the places where people who do not know the gospel are present. And I think, so let's go to, I'm surprised nobody's ever sent in a question about public school, private school, or homeschool.
Yeah.
Out of every issue, that is the one issue that I'm like,
it's one of the
I
issues
see
every
equal
parent,
amounts of pros and cons for each of the three
Yeah.
options. If someone wants to throw in charter school, sure. I don't know anything about charter school, but yeah. What were you saying though?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it's a good example of a way to be present, more present, you could say, in the lives of unbelievers is public school. But like you're getting at, I think there are costs as well. I don't, so again, my personal take on the issue is it depends on the kid. And
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't think I personally don't have a preference between the three. Part of me would lean toward like seeing the benefits of public school for this reason, like being present in the places where people are. My hesitancy is when you start having teachers, because I went to public school most of my life, and I love the idea of being with peers in an unbelieving context. The thing that I am a little cautious of, and I think most people are, is like when your teachers are the ones that are maybe teaching. I'm not talking about evolution. I'm talking about like very contrary to the gospel stuff, which again, we don't have to go down that road.
Sure.
But I say all that to say, I see the pros and cons of all three. If you're not in public school, which again, there's almost a difference too, which again, we don't have time to get into, of like your kids versus you. But like, you don't send your kids out necessarily on themselves as missionaries per se. You have to be on mission as a family. Or if you don't have kids in school, or you don't have kids at all, like you yourself has to be present. For a lot of people, this is inevitable. Like you're in a workplace, you're in a neighborhood, but I do think it takes a level of intentionality. I do think post-COVID, this is harder because maybe
no, it is.
It's just people work from home more.
Yep.
People are online more, which I think it's a little bit trickier to be. You can be faithfully present online. It just takes a little bit higher of a level of wisdom and intentionality. So there's a way to do that. And I think like Rich Mully is someone who has thought really well and hard about how do you be faithfully present online. So I think there's a way to do that by, connecting with people online. And that's a good conversation that I'm not very well versed in. But some people I know choose to withdraw from online in order to protect the same people that may not watch a rated R show or whatever, because they're a little worried, like they'll be affected by it. I feel that way about social media, but I don't think everyone should. I think there's some people that can handle it. I can't because I'm too affected by it. Same with public school. I think there's pros and cons to each of these things, and it's going to take the person. It's knowing like, is your kid affected by public school? Yeah. But everyone should be seeking to be more present somewhere. I don't think there's a necessary prescription for everyone. Like you need to do X, Y, or Z. But I do think everyone should be thinking, how can I be more present in the lives of people who disagree with me? Because there's a great book by Ben Sass. He was a former Nebraska senator, Christian guy, where he wrote a book called Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How We Can Heal, where he talked about, again, I think he wrote it before COVID, how America is increasingly polarizing. Yeah. So this is not just a Christian issue. This is I would say a very society-wide issue where people are not present very often with people they disagree with. You could say this even from the form of like, people are going to movie theaters less. They're staying home to watch Netflix. You're like, why is that a big deal? It's like, you are not around other people in neutral spaces as much as you used to be. Yeah.
And I'm not saying New England's bad enough.
What's that?
New England's bad enough.
Right. Yeah.
And then just all that, it's an extra layer already.
Right. And I've talked with people like Pete and other restaurant owners that you could see the data is showing people aren't going out to restaurants as much. And there's probably an economic factor there too. Like it's, people have less discretionary income, but it's just a reality. You're not rubbing shoulders as much, remote work with people. So it's the takeaway there is it's going to take intentionality. Yeah. It's going to take creativity. I think one just practical thing, there's a whole lot that could be said here, is be consistent with whatever you do. If you have a barber, go to the same barber, even if they're not your favorite, or even if they raise the price. If you go to a brewery, go to the same brewery, go to Backbeat consistently. If you go on a walk, go on the same
Backbeat
walk
every night. Nathaniel.
Won't go to Walmart and Backbeat every day. But just be consistent and keep your eyes open. That the one phrase that sticks out to me is Paul is going through the Agora. He's going through the Areopagus every day. And he's praying, Lord, show. So go on the same walk with your family every day.
That reminds me of Patty.
Yeah.
Where she does like a ministry at her, I think it's a Market Basket.
Yeah.
And like she's always comes through to like the same checkout people. And I think she comes on a specific day. And I think she hands out like little Hershey kisses or something. Like it's just something like that. And she just repeatedly does this, and they know her. They've gotten to know her. And
that's being that's living out what Paul's doing. Cause I often hear people say, and I feel this too, I'm like, I'm not just going to randomly say, you know, Jesus loves you, like to someone I meet on the road for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you know, probably not the wisest idea. Maybe it is. I don't know if you have that type of personality, but like if you run into the same person 50 times, like Brennan and I, for example, we have this route we do in the mornings a lot. And there have been a couple of people we just see, and we're getting deeper and deeper in conversation.
You can only say, the weather's great today so many times.
Exactly. And the Lord will open up conversations like, are you being present?
Yeah.
Be persistent. And don't see this as some kind of evangelism project. See it as like, I want to love people. And the thing that I think people in our society most desperately crave is steadfastness, because people are flaky. People are so flaky, like in and out, low commitment. They're gone the second. It's the consumerization of everything in society. There's no more deeply entrenched, all the sociologists are talking about, there's no more deeply entrenched communities, even churches. Yeah. People come and go left and right in a way that was just not possible 200 years ago, because you didn't have a car. Yeah. You had one church. It's like, I'm either here or somewhere else. But this is the case for anything. People move in and out of New England. So I'm saying this to someone who's like, you know, it's tough to stay here economically, right? Like, stay if you can. I remember Tim Keller would always say, if you're here in New York for 2 years, stay for 3. If you're planning on staying for 5, stay for 7. And I would say the same thing in our congregation, but just stay consistent. If you go to the gym and you see a cheaper gym, don't go there. Stay at the gym you have. If you've made relationships, just be persistent. Anyway, I'm just trying to be practical here. Any other thoughts? You're the one who's been here far longer, so I'd love to hear like from you. Just so everyone knows, I'm not good at a lot of these things. I'd say the only one of these of the I.M.P.A.C.T that I'm good at is the I. Yeah. I'm more of like an intellectual, like I like to think about ideas. I don't like to live them out. I'm a coward. So I like to say it in my head. So I can do the I and the C. I'm good at critiquing, but I'm not good at the M or the P or the A or the T.
I'll say with the P, it's different based on like life stage, right? You have to keep reinventing that for yourself, because right now we have 2 small kids.
Sure.
So that actually opens up a lot of doors for that, right? Gymnastics, we're at soccer, we're at, you know, school, we're at things like that. So lately that's been it for us. But then trying to say like, okay, how can we make these, you know, you'll go to gymnastics for 10 weeks and then it's done. And then you might not see those people again. Yeah. So that it's not perfect. There's been, I think like you're saying, you just have to be thoughtful about this stuff. Like, where can we dig in deeper? Like our neighbors have a kid who's right in between Zachary and Sienna's age. And like, that's like, he sees this playing out in the backyard and it's just a common thing. It's becoming common for us to be like, come on over, come play on the trampoline, come play. And he'll come over and his parents will stop by and whatnot. Yeah. And yeah, just like, we're like, oh, that's a thing that we can do recurring and dig deeper into those relationships. And that's, I mean, I've talked about that relationship in the past, where we have talked to them about less superficial conversations about things, because they seem equally interested in talking about the deeper things of life. So that's been already really fruitful and fun. Yeah. I enjoy that stuff. But it depends.
Hospitality's big too. Kind of what I'm getting at is like, I wonder how many people just need an invite in.
Yeah. People are hungry for that. Yeah. You know, people are hungry. They invited us over. Our neighbors invited us over for like a breakfast thing before we invited them over. Like they were hungry for this, which we were psyched about. We're like,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then we had them over for pizza, and we hope to do more stuff this summer too, you know? But I think it's intentionality. I think it's like, if you're hearing this, like, stop, think, make a list. Like, where are the areas that I can actually be consistent, like you're saying?
Yeah. Because again, our cultural moment is, there's pros and cons to this, especially with technology. You can be connected to more people than you've ever been able to be connected to, but it's harder to go deeper than I think it's ever been. And again, I could go into a long diatribe on why I think that is, but because it's harder to go deeper, you gotta, you know, be wise as serpent, as gentle as dove. You gotta push. You gotta you gotta do things that make you feel uncomfortable. Inviting people over that you don't necessarily, it's not a knee jerk reaction or like a muscle memory to do that. Hospitality is hard, but I think it's what the world needs.
Yeah.
People are going to unbelievers are probably going to need time in a believer's home before they're going to step foot into a church.
Sure.
That's why, even going back to the conversational philosophy of ministry, I'm not assuming unbelievers are going to walk into the door uninvited. I don't think there's many people, I could be wrong, but I don't think many people are just like, I feel questions in life, I'm going to look up the nearest church. It's probably like they've had dinner at a believer's house for a number of times and they feel comfortable. And I'm assuming the believer has explained some things to them.
Yeah.
That was not the case maybe 30 years ago.
Yeah,
or at least that's not the case in the South today, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can't picture myself out of curiosity going into a temple service, like temple, and being like, oh, I'm just curious to get to know my neighbor and whatnot. Like, and in the same way, I almost don't expect my neighbor to do that with church, right? To just be like, oh, I'm curious what my neighbors think about this thing, and attending a church.
Yeah. It's going to take presence, and presence takes intentionality.
Okay, let's get to A.
Sweet.
Affirming your unless there's more you want to say on presence.
That's great. I think the presence one is just really challenging.
Yeah.
And I'm very much still trying to figure it out. So I don't really have much practical advice to give. Okay. Affirm the agreements. Okay. Well, I'm just going to 2 minutes in the text and we'll kind of tease out some things, how this look like. Okay. Paul affirms the points of agreement between Christianity and Stoic philosophy. He affirms immortality of God, the proximity of God to humans, God's providence, human accountability, all things Stoicism and Christianity have in common. And he even affirms some stuff with the Epicureans, which are a little bit further from Christianity, meaning God doesn't, they and Christians would believe God doesn't live in man-made temples or need sacrifices. Let me back up real quick. I.M.P.A.C.T, I think there's a necessary order to this. You need to know before you are moved, and you need to be moved before you're present. And when you are present, now we're kind of talking about what do you do when you're present? That's more the ACT. So the affirmation needs to take place before the challenge. I think oftentimes Christians come in hot, challenging culture, challenging narratives, and they never stop to do the work of identification, which we kind of talked about this a little bit with you, with Joe, talking about Joe Rogan and me talking about the bear. Like we were looking for the positives, or not necessarily the positives, the overlap between the gospel story and the other story.
I think of this in like Christian apologetics. It's like, do you think there's objective good versus evil, right? Like you can start on grounds of agreement of like, this, to kill someone thoughtlessly is bad. Do you agree there?
Totally. And even like, so let me just point out what Paul does and then how we can do it real quick. Paul communicates in a contextualized manner. I could go into the weeds of how he actually follows. It's really interesting. He follows a Greco-Roman structure of argument in a way that he does not do in, Iconium or Lystra or the other places he preaches. Second, he anticipates objections. So he can, let me put it first one. He communicates in a way that they would understand. He doesn't go straight to like Old Testament sources. He communicates in their structure. He also knows their objections. The number one objection that they probably would have given him is, you don't understand our idols. But Paul walks around. He's careful to point out he walks around the city and he looked carefully. He makes sure he knows their system. And third, he states in the gospel in a way that addresses a felt need. So Paul asserts that this God whom the Athenians worship as unknown, he doesn't just state, he's not introducing a foreign deity or a foreign idea per se. He's actually saying you have this deity within your system. Derek was really, I think it was a really interesting thing he pointed out in the sermon of they had this unknown God that they had sacrificed. So he points to a felt need within their system. So let's go back to justice. Justice is a clear craving for most people in our society, Christian or non-Christian. You need to come along and say, yes, we need to have someone who is impartial and fair and righteous do something about the evils in this world. And I think a lot of unbelievers, not all of them, but a lot of them would actually object to Christianity because of justice. In two ways. They would say Christians are not being just. Look at the Catholic scandals. Look at the Protestant scandals. Look at these mega churches seem like they care more about building their brand than they do serving the poor. And Jesus doesn't do that. But then also they would object maybe even to God, because they would say, how could a good and loving God allow so much pain and evil and suffering? So their pushback is justice. So we need to come along and say, affirm, yes, we are totally on board with caring for those who are afflicted. And we need to do that in a way that understands the stories. I think the way this looks, again, kind of getting into the practicality, is find the points of agreement. Tim Keller was so wise to say, when you're in a disagreement with a brother or sister or even a neighbor, and you're pretty confident they are 80% wrong, find the 20% and start with the 20% that they're right on. So if someone comes to me and is like, I think you're being a jerk, and I'm convinced that they're wrong, I'm not going to say, no, I'm not. I should say, you're right. I do come across a little too forthright. What am I trying to say? A little too blunt. And I need to tone back. And it's agreeing. It's not a fake agreement where you're like, I should consider that. That's dumb. It's saying like, you're right. Where are they right? Or if someone's like, that's unloving that you said X, Y, or Z, you're like, you know what? I can improve in that. And then you go to the C, which we'll get to in a second, the challenge. But we have to start with affirmation. The theological justification of this is the Lord made the world good. So the world is good but fallen. It's not intrinsically evil. It's intrinsically good but bent. Therefore, we need to look for the glimmers of creation, the creative goodness in all things. Everything is created good but fallen, which means that when you're looking at people's idols and they want to be beautiful, and let's say they're putting way too much time into their physical appearance, you don't come along and say it's sinful to spend $50,000 on Botox, even though it's dumb to spend $50,000 on Botox unless it's a surgical necessity or something like that. But you say, I perceive that you want to be seen and affirmed and loved, and that's what you were created to have. You don't come along and say, you spent $80,000 on a car that's wasteful, blah, blah, blah. You say, I see that you really want something lasting. You want to relish in the beauty of creation. In every single sin, this is what Augustin would point out, there's something good that we're striving for that we're off on. Now you could argue some sins we're 99.9% off on, but there's still 0.1% there was a good we were after. You'd also argue that even in everything righteous we do, there's some sin that taints it. When you serve the poor, you might do it for a good reason, but there's some part of you that is actually, I hope that people notice. Everything's a mixed bag, but you got to start with the affirmation. You've got to start with what goodness are they after? Even the idols of the Israelites, they turned to the wood and stone, and that was wrong. And I'm not saying the idols are kind of okay. That's not what I'm saying. They're evil. But what did they want by turning to wood and stone? They wanted something that was accessible. The problem wasn't that they wanted something imminent and accessible. The problem was they forgot the Lord was in their midst. The problem was they looked to idols made of wood and stone to be what God already was for them. So when we try to take our walk with Jesus into our own hands, the problem is not our desires. Usually it's we're looking for the right thing in the wrong place. Or at least, let me stop there. But does that make sense? Like that's the affirmation. The C and the T are pretty simple. So we can move on because again, we're coming up on an hour, so I don't know how much time, but
Yeah, sure.
what the practicalities there are. Let me just give some more. When you read a New York Times article,
Well, Steve, can you remind us? So it's challenging those narratives where they're inconsistent, right?
yeah. So before you challenge, you need to say, so I see a lot of people come in and they jump to the C. I jump to the C really quick. This is the problem I have. But they need to stop and say, what are some good that we have here? So I've seen people do this, for example. Unbelievers shouldn't be talking about justice at all because they're basing it on totally Christian ideas and they don't even have the right. They have no moral compass. Like it's they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong. Let's start first with, I'm mad about this injustice too. You saw people do this in 2020, man, just to get controversial with Black Lives Matter. Instead of jumping on the points of agreement, they only jump to, well, there's some Marxist tendency. Of course, there's some problematic Marxist tendencies with the organization. We'll get into that with the C. Instead of saying, yes, we need to be arguing for the image of God, they jump straight to the C. If you really want the C to land, you need a convincing A. You need a convincing affirmation if you challenge. Let's get to the C.
That applies in things outside of just like, that applies in life. If you want to, not that the goal is to influence people, but you do want to influence people of your perspective. If you want to influence people, finding the common ground will always be a more effective way because you kind of you're somewhat unshielding yourself and saying, yes, like I'm not, it's like conceding a point at the same time.
Sure.
Like if you concede a point and say, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that. That gives you credence to the thought that you're taking into account the things that they're saying. And that allows them to then act in the same way and open themselves up. And it becomes less combative and more about a sharing of ideas.
Exactly. What you're trying to persuade somebody, you're not trying to beat them over the head and prove you're right. And again, we could talk about this for a while, but like
winning an argument gains nothing.
Exactly. Winning an art, like you're not necessarily after proving you're right. You're after trying to win people to the truth. And again, it's hard for us because I don't think we see this a lot. Like we're going to watch some presidential debates.
Yeah.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump are not trying to persuade one another. I don't even think they're trying to persuade anybody. I think they're trying to shore up their own bases. They might be trying to persuade a little bit some people in the middle, but we just, as a society, the Western world has lost the art of persuasion. Not just the church, but the church has sadly followed the trends rather than, been a rock in a current that's not following the trends. We need to learn the art of persuasion from Paul and from Jesus. Okay. Because we have a framework that gives us the doctrine of common grace. Okay, now C is very interesting to me because how Paul challenges them. He comes in and he says, let me just quote Acts 17 here. He says, Paul doesn't just affirm or assimilate to the Stoic and Epicurean philosophies. He challenges their teaching and points out their own inconsistencies. He says basically, you need a God who's not made by hands. Otherwise, he's not worth worshiping. You need a resurrection. Otherwise, death is going to obliterate anything that you guys have ever done. You need gods who are not bound up in the same ethical problems that we have. We could talk about what Paul does for a while, but what this looks like for us is we need to challenge people on internal inconsistencies, not necessarily disagreements with Scripture. We need to get to disagreements with Scripture, but that needs to always come last. Here's what that means. We need to show that every other story apart from the gospel story is unfulfilling. It does not come true on its promises. So for example, we'll keep the justice thing going. Yeah, I agree also that what's going on in a lot of places is right or wrong. But how can we set up a form of justice that doesn't just create new oppressors? This is the theme of the Hunger Games movie, right? Like they're like down with the Capitol, but if we're not careful, we're always going to set up somebody in the place that's just as bad. District 13 was just the Capitol all over again. That was, in my opinion, the hidden message of the Hunger Games. Now, they didn't resolve the tension because Katniss just shoots I forget her name, the new president, and then just walks away and is like, yeah, cool, anarchy. That doesn't work in society. because then another anarchy is going to set up its place. But our society doesn't have the resources to set up a non-oppressive absolute. Richard Bauckham talks about this, and Tim Keller talks about this. We need a form of justice that is true and consistent, but is from someone who's perfect and doesn't just want to obliterate the people who transgress, but wants to redeem the people who transgress. And Jesus is the only one who has that. Because we as a Western society, I think we've seen the insufficiencies of our cry for justice. We're like, justice, justice, justice. And then we start looking for all the injustices. And then before you know it, everyone's unjust. And the way that we got to finding the unjust people was unjust. And so everyone's dirty. So who therefore has the power to lead us? It's going to be the person that has the loudest voice and is powerful. And we're back to square one. We're back to another oppressive group. We're back to another problem. We also need a standard and an ethic. Again, notice I haven't talked about the Bible yet. We need a standard and an ethic that's outside of us, that transcends cultural values, not one that's inevitably product of culture, because you have people in the West going to people in places like Africa saying that what you're doing and how you're treating women is wrong. The people in Africa are like, you're just projecting your Western colonial cultural ideas on us. And they're right. Unless you have a God who's outside of time and space, but who has entered into time and space, you're going to have either relativism or colonialism. And there's no way around it. So we need to challenge systems. And I think the best way we can do this, and we talked about this about 2 months ago with death, death is the ultimate challenger. Because death comes along with justice and says you could actually get close to a utopia, but there's no way to undo the injustices that have been done. And deep down, unbeliever, or whoever you're talking to, you know, and you want those rights to be done wrong. Why not find a system what's that?
Those rights to be done wrong?
I'm sorry, those wrongs to be done right.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. You want all the people that were killed and murdered in the Holocaust. You want justice for them. And even if we set up some kind of new utopia, we couldn't ever work the clock backwards. Wouldn't it be awesome if you had a system of justice that didn't just redeem people, transform them? Wouldn't it be awesome if you had a system that wasn't just impartial, but actually redeemed things that have already happened that are wrong, that made all the wrongs in the world right once and for all? And then you get to the T. You say, because of the resurrection, all that is sad that will come untrue. I don't know how the mechanics of all the wrongs being written right, I don't know how that will tangibly work, but I know someone who does, and that's Jesus. I know someone that all the cards seem stacked against him. The darkness could not have seemed worse. And he turned it, the cross, an innocent man suffering, and he turned it around into a light that was far greater than we could ever imagine. And if the worst thing can become the best thing, the cross can become an empty tomb, then the sufferings we experience on the day-to-day life can be redeemed in part now and in full when Christ returns. And I think just showing people their own systems are not going to give them what they're going to give them. That's going to make people say, I'm hungry for something more. Because people are not hungry right now. I think they are, but they could be hungrier. I think people, and we talked about this even in Sunday school, you brought up, people are starting to see on an academic level and a personal level that secular humanism does not give you everything. Christian Smith's written about this, how science and a materialistic worldview, he's a sociologist in Notre Dame, cannot give you a cohesive system for justice. It cannot give you a meaning in life. And this whole, everything I've said is what Keller is doing in meaning, making sense of God. He's saying you need a meaning that no circumstance can take away. You need an identity that doesn't crush or exclude others. You need a justice that doesn't create new oppressors, and you need ethics that are robust. You need satisfaction that's not going to be obliterated by death or suffering. You need a hope that can face anything. Everybody needs these things. And what Charles Taylor writes, I forget what the essay was, in one of his, I think it's Philosophical Essays is the name of the book. He says, in a secular society, what we need to do is compare all the other options. And when he's saying we, he doesn't mean Christians, he means everybody. What gives us the best account of the way things are and the best account of how what things can be? And I think Christianity, if we believe it's true, if we believe the gospel story is not just the true story, but the best story, we can let the other narratives show their insufficiencies, even before we get to the gospel story. And then we get to the T, which is the gospel story explains all the other stories. Another great book, it's so long, but I just want to highlight it, is Biblical Critical Theory.
The T is tell the good news of the gospel.
Tell the good news of the gospel in a way that shows the fulfillment of their longings. Because that's what Paul's doing. He's not just saying like, Jesus is your Lord and Savior, period. That's obviously true.
Yeah.
He's saying someone that wants justice, you need to say Jesus is the true and perfect justice. You need to fulfill the longings of their heart. And Jesus there's always an element of connection and there's always an element of challenge. But when people see that Jesus is the fulfillment of their longings, they're going to be willing to say, all right, I don't understand this teaching on sexuality. I don't understand this teaching on hell. But you know what? I see that Jesus is the only source of life. So my understanding is not there yet, but I'm going to trust him even though I'm not there on understanding. I'm going to give my life to him because I've seen that every other well runs dry. I've seen that every other bread, you eat it and you're no longer satisfied. And I'm not sure where Jesus is going to take me, but I know he's going to take me to salvation. That's what you see the disciples doing in John 6. They're like, Jesus, this saying that you just taught us is really, really hard. But you know what? We don't see any other option. So we're not sure what you're saying, but we're going to stick with you through thick and thin because we know two things. We know that every other idol doesn't satisfy, and we know that you will, even if we don't understand how just yet. One last thing I'll say, and I'd love just any questions that you have, clarity questions and like maybe practical how to tease this out. You see this missional impact even throughout the prophets. When God is critiquing the idols, he's not just saying idols bad, Yahweh worship good. What the Lord often does is he's saying, that wood you're worshiping, how's that working out for you? You're going to eat on it tomorrow. You just cut down a tree. You see this, go read the Isaiah 40 through 66, and you're going to see this A and the C and the T. You're going to mostly the C and the T. You're going to see a critique from God that the idols, they're deaf. They have ears, but they don't hear. And so you even see an A there. You want a God who can hear you. So you made an idol with ears, but the idol doesn't hear you. You need me. I hear you. You made an idol with eyes. That means you want to be seen, but they don't see you. You need to be seen. I see you. You need an idol that can redeem you, but they're not going to redeem you. They're going to turn you into a sacrifice. Anyway, so I'm beating a dead horse perhaps, but it's one of those things that when you see this phenomenon that Paul's doing here, someone might say you're reading too much into Acts 17. And when I started seeing this in Acts 17, I started reading Lesslie Newbigin talking about affirmation of common grace, critique of the common curse, pointing to the fulfillment in Christ. I started to see it everywhere, but particularly in the prophets, where the prophets are critiquing idols, not just they're wrong. And I was told my whole life, don't follow sin because it's wrong, which is true. But I think the lie that Satan has snuck in from the very beginning, sin is wrong, but it's better. It's ice cream. You're going to get fat, but at least you're going to enjoy it. Sex with someone other than your spouse, it may be wrong, but it's going to be fun. And what the Bible consistently says over and over again, it's not just wrong, it's unfulfilling.
Yeah.
The lie is not true. That's what he told Eve, right? You're going to be cast out from God's presence, but you're going to get something just as good. God's holding out from you. I don't think Satan ever really challenged the idea that eating the apple was not going to lead to some consequence, but he challenged God's motives. Are you sure? I think he's holding out on you. He doesn't want you to have full knowledge of good and evil. And he still does the same today. So what we need to do is basically undo the lies of the serpent and say, if I I'll shut up after this. Go listen to the song, It's Not Enough by the Modern Post. That is one of the most effective discipleship tools and evangelism tools you'll ever hear. It's 4 minutes long. And if you're tempted as a Christian to leave the faith, go listen to it, because he goes through and he says, it's such a powerful song, man. He says, I could have all the money in the world and it wouldn't be enough. And he even says, I could make all the rights wrong and it wouldn't be enough. I could do all the justice in the world. It wouldn't be enough. I could have a perfect family and it wouldn't be enough. I could have all the power in the world, and it's not enough. It's not enough. And man, people just need to realize it's not enough. That's the C. And the T is, he is more. Now, he's not just enough, but he's more than you could ever imagine. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional, but it's not enough. Such a powerful song. I have to remind myself that all the time. And that's going back to the I. We need to identify our own idols. And if we idolize our families, we need to realize no perfect family is going to satisfy our soul. It's good, but it's not a soul satisfier. No amount of money is going to satisfy our soul. And we need to tell ourselves that and our neighbors that. We're way over time maybe, but I don't know. Like, if people are still listening, they're obviously interested, but any follow-ups? That's what you see Paul doing.
I don't know. Is there any, I don't know the best way to tease out more out of it. What are the thoughts you have on it? I mean,
there's so much richness in the gospel.
Yeah.
Everybody has a different narrative. Jesus is the fulfillment of every single faulty desire people have. Or, I'm sorry, every right thing that they had in their faulty desire. You cannot exhaust the depths of the gospel.
Well, yeah. Let me actually, there is something here too.
For sure.
On that. You were talking in Sunday school about how you deal with the high schoolers or the what is it? The youth.
Yeah.
And you said basically in that is you don't start with the T. You kind of, in a way, do this, right? Like you're the A-C-T of you look at the culture, you can say this better, but you look at the culture. Okay, what are the ideas expressed by the culture?
Yep.
What's good about those ideas? What's wrong? What's lacking in those ideas?
Yep.
Or that position, and then saying, okay, what does the gospel have that perspective doesn't have?
Yeah.
Right? Is
Totally.
that what you're saying?
Yeah. So that's the way you do catechesis, which is basically the same, like what you're saying. I take out the M and the P because those are being moved to compassion and being present are more circumstantial realities.
Sure.
They're not things you're doing, or they're not things you're saying. They're things you're doing. So if you're in a classroom, I'm assuming the M and the P, but the thing you're doing when we're training our children how to live, how to become a Daniel. One of the greatest articles, super short, I'd encourage people to read, Dare to Make a Daniel by Alan Jacobs. He's saying we're in Babylon, and we can link it. We're in Babylon. We need to be Daniels who are faithfully present. They're not isolating and they're not assimilating. But the simple question Alan Jacobs asked is, how do you think Daniel was formed? Daniels don't grow on trees. They're made. They're formed by the power of the Holy Spirit and by practices of spiritual disciplines. And so we need to form them. And one of the ways we need to form them is counter catechesis, is what he says. And Keller picks up that idea. And it sounds antagonistic, but it's not. It's identifying the idols. So instead of saying, the chief end of human beings is to glorify God and enjoy them forever, you say, before you get there, you say, what does our society tell us that our chief end is? And what do you kids think? What are you living as if your chief end is? Because that's probably not the chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. What does your schedule tell you the chief end of your life is? Most of us, it's to have an easy life. It's to self-actualize. Anyway, you affirm it's good to seek comfort. It's good to it's good to have a level of ambition. But if your ambition is selfish, and this is where you get to the C, the challenge or the subvert, any selfish ambition isn't going to satisfy you. Again, I'm doing this quickly. And then you need to channel that ambition toward God. You can do this with any teaching, but we need to not just teach kids, that's the T, what the Bible says. We need to help them understand what they are currently following in the world that's got some common grace elements, but ultimately will unsatisfy them. Because the only way people are going to follow the Christian faith is if they see through the schemes of the world and they see into the beauty of the gospel. And I think the church, especially with our own people, our kids especially, and our new believers, have only done the T. But we haven't deconstructed the counter narratives. So you have people saying like, I don't know if I believe in the Bible's view of marriage because I think we should be able to follow our own desires. And if God was really loving, he would let me live however I wanted sexually. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to say, no, but the Bible says this? And you're like, yeah, but the Bible's truth doesn't seem good to me. They need the narratives they've adopted, often subconsciously, to be deconstructed. They need to be told, see, you're saying that sexuality is an identity, and I'm not sure that's true. Why do you think that's true? You need to see that self-fulfillment doesn't necessarily give you what you think it does. Look at J.D. Rockefeller with money. He wasn't satisfied. Look at the people that are Sleeping around, all the studies show, especially for women, the more people you sleep around with, the higher your anxiety is. Louis Perry has a great book. Sexual Revolution it didn't give us what we thought it would. Women are not, I'm not saying we need to go back to the 50s. Don't hear that. But we were promised this, like, if women were liberated sexually, they would be more happy. The data shows otherwise. Again, I'm not saying we go back. Hear that. There are plenty of problems with 50s view of women. But the secular view is not better. We jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. And that's what a lot of even secular people are pointing out. And that's why you need to know the secular critiques. Sorry, I'm going on and on.
Sure.
Listen to the secular critiques that agree with the Christian critiques and use those. They agree. Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian, but he's pointing out something's wrong in our society. Learn what he's saying. Anyway, I could go on. This is really like a rich category of conversation.
Let's do this. If you're still with us, we could keep going on and on. So put together your questions. If there's anything here that you'd like Nathaniel to tease out more on any of this stuff, send it our way, and we'll get to it. Does that work?
Absolutely. Again, it's hard to do this in a concise way because it's like a theme you see everywhere in the Bible and everywhere in life. So.
I mean, this is easier than in a sermon. Sure. I'd say, we can go down the little rabbit holes, and they can always hit the fast forward button and
sure.
and meet back up with us.
Totally.
So, okay.
Well, thanks for bearing with all our, especially my rabbit trails.
I've enjoyed it. So this has been great. Cool. If you're still with us, thanks for listening. We drop episodes once a week. Once again, we are Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. Come worship with us. And we will see you hopefully this Sunday.
Grace and peace, brothers and sisters.
Peace.